Did you know there was a time when so-called science tried to prove that the Irish were biologically inferior? Sounds absurd, right? Well, buckle up because history is full of wild, head-scratching moments. Imagine opening a science book and reading that an entire group of people, because of their skull shape, facial features, or even the way they spoke, were supposedly less evolved. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But in the 19th century, this wasn't just a weird conspiracy theory. It was an idea backed by some of the most influential scientists of the time. And guess who was often on the receiving end of this nonsense? The Irish. During this era, British and American scholars used junk science like phrenology, the study of skull shapes, and eugenics, the idea of improving human genetics, to argue that some races were superior to others. And surprise, surprise, they always put themselves at the top. The Irish, on the other hand, were often depicted as primitive, ape-like, and even unfit for modern civilization. Check out this caricature from the 1800s, show an old racist cartoon. Yes, people actually believed this. But how did such bizarre ideas gain traction? And more importantly, how did the Irish fight back? Let's dive in and uncover one of history's most outrageous scientific blunders. Imagine walking into a fancy lecture hall in the 1800s, expecting to learn about science, only to hear a scientist claim that some people are simply less evolved than others. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, back then, this wasn't just a wild opinion, it was mainstream science. The 19th century was obsessed with categorizing people. Scientists and intellectuals, especially in Britain and the United States, used pseudoscience to justify social hierarchies. They wanted to prove, through science, that some races were naturally superior while others were, well, not so lucky. Enter phrenology, eugenics, and social Darwinism, the unholy trinity of junk science. Phrenologists claimed you could determine intelligence and behavior by feeling the bumps on someone's head. Eugenicists believed only the fittest should reproduce. And social Darwinists? They twisted Darwin's theory to argue that some races were simply meant to rule over others. And guess who was often ranked near the bottom of this so-called racial hierarchy? The Irish. For centuries, the Irish had been viewed as unruly, uneducated, and unfit for civilization. But in the 1800s, these prejudices took on a scientific twist. Scientists began measuring skulls, analyzing facial features, and even studying Irish behavior, all to prove that they were an inferior race. But how did they come to such absurd conclusions? Let's talk about one of the strangest ideas in this whole mess, the so-called skull debate. Okay, imagine this. You walk into a doctor's office, and instead of asking how you feel, they grab your head and start feeling for bumps. That's not a joke. That was phrenology. And in the 19th century, people actually believed in it. Phrenologists claimed that the shape of your skull could determine your intelligence, personality, and even moral character. A high forehead. That meant you were wise. A smaller skull. Oh no, you were obviously doomed to a life of ignorance. And guess which group they claimed had the worst skulls? The Irish. British scientist Robert Knox, a major player in racial pseudoscience, argued that the Irish had smaller, rounder skulls, which made them primitive and less intelligent. He even suggested they were naturally rebellious and incapable of self-governance. To make things worse, British and American newspapers started publishing cartoons of Irish people with exaggerated features, big jaws, small foreheads, hunched postures, making them look like apes. It wasn't just bad science, it was deliberate propaganda. And here's the kicker. These same scientists used their own skulls as the standard for intelligence. Convenient, right? But they didn't stop there. Some even suggested that the Irish weren't just less intelligent, they were a missing link between humans and apes. Yep, they actually said that. And that brings us to the next bizarre chapter in this saga. If you thought the skull thing was weird, wait until you hear this. Some scientists actually believed that the Irish were closer to apes than to humans. Let's rewind to the 19th century. The Great Chain of Being was a popular idea. It was basically a ranking system that put humans at the top and animals at the bottom. According to some racist scientists, certain groups of people were less evolved than others. And guess who they put right above chimpanzees? The Irish. Newspapers and magazines published cartoons of Irish people drawn with exaggerated animalistic features, sometimes side by side with apes, to emphasize the comparison. One of the most famous illustrations depicted an Irishman with a hunched back, wild hair, and a heavy brow, right next to a chimpanzee. The goal: to dehumanize the Irish and make them seem unworthy of equal rights, jobs, and even immigration. In fact, these ideas were used to justify discrimination against Irish immigrants in Britain and America. But let's be real here, these so-called scientists weren't exactly unbiased. They always seemed to place themselves at the top of their made-up hierarchy. Funny how that works, huh? So how did the Irish fight back against this nonsense? And how did real science eventually debunk these racist myths? Stick around, because the truth is even more fascinating than the lies. All right, we've talked about the ridiculous science behind this whole thing, but let's be real. This was never just about skull shapes or evolution. It was about power. The 19th century was not a great time for the Irish. Under British colonial rule, they were treated as second-class citizens in their own country. They faced extreme poverty, famine, and forced displacement. And when many fled to Britain and America looking for a better life, they were met with something else: hatred and discrimination. British media painted the Irish as lazy, violent, and untrustworthy. Think of the worst stereotypes imaginable, then crank them up to cartoonish levels. Newspapers ran illustrations of drunken, brawling Irishmen with captions like, "The Irish Savage," or "A Burden on Civilization." But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about bias, it was about justifying oppression. If the Irish could be scientifically proven to be inferior, then it made it easier for the British to deny them rights, keep them in poverty, and block them from positions of power. Ever had someone make up a ridiculous excuse just to put you down? Well, the Irish got a whole fake science dedicated to it. And it wasn't just Britain. In America, the Irish were seen as a threat. People feared that waves of Irish immigrants would bring crime, chaos, and, according to some, the downfall of civilization itself. Which brings us to one of the most dangerous ideas of the 19th and 20th centuries: eugenics. Ever heard of Francis Galton? He was the guy who took one look at human genetics and thought, hey, what if we just controlled who gets to have kids? Yep, that's eugenics. The idea that humanity could be improved by encouraging superior people to reproduce and preventing inferior ones from doing the same. And spoiler alert, the Irish were often labeled as inferior. Galton's ideas quickly became popular among elites, politicians, and scientists. They claimed that certain races, especially the Anglo-Saxon elite, were naturally smarter, stronger, and more civilized. And others, well, let's just say they weren't invited to the future. In Britain and the US, anti-Irish sentiment got tangled up with eugenics propaganda. Newspapers ran headlines warning about the Irish problem, with some even comparing Irish immigration to the spread of disease. Some politicians genuinely believed that allowing too many Irish into the country would weaken the gene pool. It got so bad that in America eugenicists lobbied to restrict Irish immigration, using bad science to claim they were genetically prone to crime, laziness, and even feeble-mindedness. People were seriously out here acting like the Irish were a contagious disease. And yet, despite all this, the Irish didn't just accept these labels. They fought back, hard. They debunked the lies, challenged the discrimination, and ultimately changed their place in history. If history has taught us anything, it's this: the Irish are stubborn fighters. Despite all the racist science, the discrimination, and the terrible newspaper cartoons, the Irish didn't just sit back and accept it. They pushed back, hard. First, Irish scholars and leaders called out the nonsense with real science. They debunked phrenology, exposed the flaws in eugenics, and proved that intelligence had nothing to do with skull shape. In fact, as modern anthropology advanced, every single claim about Irish inferiority crumbled. And let's not forget the witty comebacks. One Irish politician famously mocked the British obsession with phrenology, saying, "I suppose if we measured the heads of our oppressors, we'd find the biggest bumps in dishonesty." Meanwhile, in America, Irish immigrants worked hard to prove their worth. Despite being forced into the lowest-paying jobs and living in overcrowded slums, they built strong communities, formed labor unions, and eventually climbed the social ladder. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Irish were entering politics, law enforcement, and business, showing everyone that they weren't going anywhere. And guess what? That scientific hierarchy that put them at the bottom, it aged terribly. But the fight wasn't just about proving the Irish were equal. It was about dismantling racist science as a whole. And that's where our story takes an even bigger turn. For centuries, people believed that skull shape, brain size, or even facial features determined intelligence. But as real science advanced, those ideas crumbled hard. Modern genetics and anthropology have completely debunked the idea of racial superiority. Studies in the 20th and 21st centuries confirmed what should have been obvious. All humans share 99.9% of their DNA. That tiny fraction of difference, it affects things like hair texture and skin tone, but not intelligence or worth. One of the biggest takedowns of racial pseudoscience came in 1950. When UNESCO issued a statement saying race had no scientific basis in determining intelligence or ability. Then in the 1970s and beyond, deeper studies in genetics proved that so-called racial hierarchies were completely made up. And those skull studies from the 1800s? Total nonsense. The same methods used to claim the Irish were inferior had also been applied to other groups. Each time, the results were just confirmation bias at work. By the time modern anthropology took over, phrenology and racial ranking were laughed out of science. Turns out intelligence isn't measured by skull shape, who would have guessed? But while science moved on, the effects of these fake theories lingered, and even today, the past has a way of sneaking into the present. History has a weird way of repeating itself. While racial pseudoscience is gone from mainstream academia, bad science hasn't disappeared. Take bias in artificial intelligence. Modern facial recognition software has been found to misidentify people of certain racial backgrounds more often than others. Or medical studies, where certain ethnic groups are still underrepresented, leading to gaps in healthcare. The truth is, science isn't always right, especially when people twist it to fit their own agendas. That's why critical thinking matters. We've seen how experts once used phrenology and eugenics to push discrimination. Today, misinformation can still be wrapped in the language of science to justify bias. So how do we avoid falling for it? Ask questions, look at the evidence, and remember that real science is always open to being challenged and improved. The Irish were once labelled as inferior based on completely fake studies, but they proved that no amount of bad science can define a people's worth. It's a lesson worth remembering. So what do you think? Did this history shock you? Were you surprised by how long these ideas lasted? Let me know in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into weird history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps a lot, and I'd love to bring you more fascinating stories like this. Oh, and for those who were hoping phrenology would come back in style, sorry, but your skull bumps don't predict your future. See you in the next one.